The defense of necessity is just like entrapment in the sense that it's an affirmative defense. That means that defendant has to go first to explain the defense and that the prosecution responds. So as you learn your elements, you're going to learn them from the defendant's perspective, and then we're going to see how the prosecution can rebut the elements. And just like entrapment, in the defense of necessity, our defendant actually committed the crime. The big difference is our defendant says, if you know my story, if you heard why I did it, you would think I was justified in committing this crime. Let me set the stage for you. We've had a lot of snowstorms back east over the last few years. You've seen news stories where people are stranded in their cars, sometimes for hours, waiting for help. So I want you to imagine a driver sitting in his car, freezing. He turns on the car heater, trying to get warm, but then he's worried about losing the gas. So he's sitting there for hours, and all of a sudden he spots a house in the distance. No lights are on, but he says, you know what? Instead of sitting in this car, I gotta seek shelter. I've got to go into that house. So he breaks into the house. That's a crime. It's called criminal trespass. It is the unauthorized entry into a building or on a piece of property. For those of you who remember burglary from last semester, it's not burglary because he didn't have a felonious intent, but it's still a crime that he has committed. So the question becomes, should we convict him of that crime? Common sense, principles of punishment would say, no, we shouldn't convict him of that crime. Freeze to death or break into a house? And here's where the defense of necessity comes to the rescue. It is designed to help him in a situation where he's avoiding an imminent harm by committing a lesser kind of a crime. So what I want to do in this brief lecture is give you two of the elements to the defense of necessity. We'll learn the rest in class, but these two are particularly important for you to know before you start reading your cases. And these two elements have a bit of jargon with them that we have to master. So let's begin. The first element that the defendant has to prove is that he has a reasonable belief that his conduct, or the crime he's committing, is immediately necessary to avoid imminent harm. What that means is he's looking at the crime he's going to commit and say, I've got to do this because I'm trying to avoid some imminent harm. If we were to apply it to our snowstorm, we would say that the driver is going to suggest he's got a reasonable belief that the crime of criminal trespass into that home was immediately necessary so that he could avoid the imminent harm of freezing to death. So look at what we've done. This is all about his perspective, but not just his perspective, a reasonable person's perspective given his situation. And what we did is we set up opposing points. Crime of criminal trespass on one hand, or freezing to death on the other. And that's really what element number one does. It sets the parameter for us. Is there a reasonable belief that the crime of criminal trespass into that home was immediately necessary when he was stranded on the highway in order to avoid the imminent harm of possibly freezing to death? Now I want to move to element number two. Element number two takes the parameters of element number one and now asks us to balance them. We've got our two opposing points, freezing to death on one side, breaking into a house on the other side. And what we want to say is, which is a greater harm to society? Is it the freezing or is it the breaking into a house? So the question we're going to ask for element number two is there a reasonable belief that the harm sought to be avoided by defendant is greater than the harm sought to be prevented by the law? I want to repeat that because the words don't quite match what it is that we're going to feel it to be. Is the harm sought to be avoided by defendant greater than the harm sought to be prevented by the law? So we're going to put up our two opposing points. Is the harm sought to be avoided by defendant, in this case, freezing to death, is that harm greater, more injurious than the harm society would say by breaking into someone's home? Which one is greater in terms of the harm? What we're going to do with element number two is bring in all of our policy predictions to balance those two opposing points to decide. If the harm that defendant wants to avoid is greater than breaking in, he's going to win. If the harm he's trying to avoid is less serious than the crime he commits, he's going to lose on that element. So now that you've watched this video, you have a homework assignment. Here's your job. I want you to read Allen versus State, which is our first case on the defense of necessity. And I want you to take the first two elements that I have reviewed here, and I want you to fill them in to make them specific to Allen, just in the same way that I did with our snowstorm and freezing to death versus criminal trespass. When you've filled in both elements, I want you to email me your answer. You have until Sunday evening to email that to me. And I look forward to seeing everybody on Monday.